growing great tomatoes, Holly. Most everybody that we know grows tomatoes, or 90-some-odd% of people who garden grow tomatoes. Either it's 1 or 100 or somewhere in between. But there is some techniques. Tomatoes is not an easy crop to grow.
No, especially in the Midwest or northern climates, because you're basically trying to grow a tropical plant in a non-tropical area. And tomatoes also can be, especially heirloom tomatoes, they can be a little bit tricky. Now, if you grow something like a hybrid, you are usually pretty good.
Well, let's talk about where to start, because now here in the northern portions of the United States, many of our listening areas, we're just getting to the point where we're getting very close to planting tomatoes, and there are other places that are listening that have already planted them. This is applicable for everybody. There are techniques in which you can exercise now, even if your tomatoes are in the ground, and also techniques in which you can practice and utilize before putting the tomatoes in the ground as well. So we'll start with seeds. You talked about heirloom and organic seeds, hybrid seeds. You can, most everybody who starts a garden, they get a seed from, or they get a transplant from their garden center, or they start seeds indoors. However, you had a different upbringing whenever you started the gardening, whenever you were a kid, Holly.
Right. So I grew up in Milwaukee, and we had a very small backyard. And
how small was it?
It was like the size of a postage stamp. I'm not even sure. Probably 200. No, more than that. I don't know. 80 feet maybe by 20 feet. I don't know. Whatever. So, it was not big. And
to some people that's pretty big, but yeah.
I don't think it was that. Whatever. So, so we grew a 4x4 garden, 4 foot by 4 foot or so. And we grew a lot of things, and we did not buy seedlings. I didn't know that seedlings were a thing that you transplanted. We just started our seeds right in the ground. So Memorial Day weekend, that's when we planted. You
physically put the seed of the tomato, the pepper, the eggplant in the ground. There was no taking the seedling out of a tray and planting it.
No.
Nothing.
We just got the seed packs from
wherever, yeah.
Probably the one local independent garden center, and yeah, that's what we did.
Well, okay, you can do that. However, transplanting
you can do that now. But the thing is that, and you failed to mention this because you're such a fan of seedlings. If you plant your seeds in Wisconsin, southeastern Wisconsin, it's usually typically Memorial Day weekend is when people plant their tomatoes. If you plant your seeds and you plant your seedling, they're going to grow at the same rate. They're going to typically produce at the same rate.
Yeah, they're going to, because here's the thing. Let's say a tomato is 85 days to harvest. That's not 85 days from 6 to 8 weeks before your last average frost date when you started your seed in your greenhouse or in your grow room. It's 85 days from the time you put that seedling in the ground, and then you put a seed in the ground. At 85 days, that's when the counter starts for both of those particular plants, and they will harvest at the same time. The advantage to starting seeds or using seedlings, plant starts, is you can see if the plant's going to be healthy, if the seed actually germinates, and you can get a good start, and then the counter begins on that. Well, what type of plants are best? Is there with the heirloom, organic, hybrid, but variety-wise, it really determines the geographical area in which you live. Example, San Marzano?
San Marzanos. And even like Romas, Amish paste, any of those paste tomatoes, they typically like more of a Mediterranean type climate. So, if you're not familiar with the Milwaukee area, it's on Lake Michigan. And where Joey and I live, we live very close to Lake Michigan. But where our big garden is more inland. It's probably about 8 to 10 miles more inland, and so it's a little bit different climate. As during the summer and spring and fall, it's typically cooler near the lake. So the closer you are to the lake, the cooler the temperatures are, and so that provides a different type of growing climate. And so you got to think about that. If you don't have success growing a certain type of tomato, don't feel like you failed.
You have to ask around. What works best in your particular growing area?
And that's another thing. I mean, with anything, if you don't have success growing it, don't feel like you failed. But I think the biggest thing is when you're growing tomatoes is to grow a variety. Yes, you might want like all paste tomatoes, but if you don't have a plant that is growing prolifically, and you're trying to grow only that type of tomato, you might be disappointed. So you want to try, especially if you're new to growing tomatoes, you want to try different varieties.
And if you have the availability to grow 12 tomato plants, try to grow about 3 different varieties or 4 different varieties, a couple of each. And it morphs back to growing up on the farm. We would get seed corn, seed soybeans. It wouldn't be one variety. We would have 5 or 6 or 7 varieties over, the 2 or 3 or 400 acres that we were planting, because one was supposed to be drought tolerant. The other was supposed to be a heavy, that type of thing. They're all hybrids and GMO seeds. But anyway, you didn't just buy enough for 400 acres of all one variety. And then sometimes in fields, you would plant different varieties in that field, for a variety of different reasons too. So, the other thing that people get tripped up on when planting tomatoes is soil temperature. It's warm today, let's put them in the ground, and then the next day it gets way, way cold. You have to look at the long-range forecast, and that soil temperature needs to be about 50 to 55 degrees minimum, consistently at root zone.
And I think the thing is that a lot of people get excited, especially beginning part of May, if you're in a climate that typically you don't plant your tomatoes till after Memorial Day or around Memorial Day. Sometimes we get those like 60, 70 degree days in the beginning of May. And then, or even at the end of April, right where we are now sometimes. And you're like, I can plant my tomatoes. I can start a month early. But then the temperature tends to dip and there's still warnings of frost. And that's not good for your plants. So you want to plant them smart. You want to look at the long-range forecast. You want to think about what you typically do year after year.
And the old saying is, I'd much rather plant my plants one time than the second time when my neighbor plants theirs the first time. So it's okay to wait, because it will catch up to you whenever it gets, the tomatoes and peppers, they're going to sit there and just not do anything. And they're going to have to fight and struggle to keep them alive when you probably should have waited an extra week or 2 before that. Well, let's go into some items. When we get our tomatoes planted, we want to plant them deep, unless you've got a grafted tomato. If you have a grafted tomato, those are more expensive. We don't really recommend grafted tomatoes, but
I don't think that's really important, because I don't know many people who plant grafted tomatoes.
Well, we need to make that information.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So this is plant them deep unless it's a grafted tomato.
Right.
So with that being said, when you plant them deep, Joey, explain your process. Everywhere on the stalk of the tomato, you'll see hair follicles. Those can relate and develop into roots if soil touches them. So we want to plant them as deep as possible. About 75% of the plant needs to go under soil, whether you do the trench method, whether you dig a hole. If your plant is 12 inches tall and you dig a hole 9 inches deep and you bury the bottom 9 inches, whatever the case is, we want to get as much of the plant under the soil in order for it to develop roots, because the more roots you have on the plant, the healthier and more uptake of nutrients that plant can provide, and the more energy it can be put into the fruit production. So we want to be aware of that. Also, when we're planting deep, we want to remove the leaves and the limbs of those that will be under the soil level. Additionally, we want to do some precautionary measures, meaning we want to mulch, and we want to prevent or reduce early blight, which is the discoloration of the lower leaves on your tomato plant through the growing season. It progressively works its way up until the end of the season, where you have no leaves, you have stalks, and you have fruit. And that's called early blight. It's in everybody's soil, and it's from the soil splashing up on the lower leaves, and then it works its way up. So by prevention measures, we want to mulch with a chemical-free seed grass clippings, straw, leaves, shredded paper, whatever, weed barrier, whatever we have, in order to prevent that soil from splashing up. Additionally, we can use whole grain yellow cornmeal. Right, so whole grain yellow cornmeal. So this is the stuff that typically is a little bit more expensive than just the cheap stuff. You just want to make sure on the bag or the box or whatever it says whole grain and it's yellow cornmeal. And so you want to put a handful around the base of your plant around the time of planting, and then you can do this when you get the first fruiting. And so when you do this, this has something in it called trichoderma, which is a beneficial fungi. Trichoderma is used in a lot of applications outside of the U.S. The U.S. just hasn't really become hip to it yet, but it does help prevent that early blight, and it has that beneficial fungi. So definitely you want to use that yellow whole grain cornmeal.
And there's many other things that we will get into throughout the growing season. But the main thing about all of this that we've given you, you have to take care of your plants. You just can't put them in the ground, water them, and walk away and go, okay, in 85 days, I can harvest some tomatoes, because that's not how it's going to work on any plant that you try to grow. There's much upkeep and care in which you need to provide your tomatoes, your peppers, your eggplants, everything in the garden. This is something that you're working towards a harvest, and if done correctly, a cherry tomato plant can produce between 400 and 500 cherry tomatoes over a growing season, and a beefsteak or large tomato plant can produce between 25 and 40 pounds of tomatoes over a growing season. So that is just some of the growing techniques that will allow you to have healthy, big tomatoes in your garden this year, whether you're growing in containers, raised beds, or traditional ground garden. You also want to trim the bottom of the tomatoes as they grow up, about 6 to 8 inches from ground level up the stalk, to prevent the leaves from having an opportunity to pick up that soil that gets splashed up on them, as well as we want to cage the tomatoes by using metal cages or Florida weave, or however we want to get them up off the ground, because you'll lose 50% of the produce that those plants are producing if you do not have them elevated in some form or fashion.
For more information, please visit thewisconsinvegetablegardener.com.